Antifa sees that as validation of everything they do. And so they say, yes, we do confront real far-right people, but we're also going to use all of the credibility that you've given us to go after conservatives, because really they're just secret far-right people. And so that becomes the thing. And then you hear constantly in the media, oh, well, yeah, they're giving dog whistles. That's what they're doing. They're not admitting that they're far-right. They're saying they're not. And nothing in their past seems to indicate that they are, but they're giving dog whistles. So they must secretly be far-right. And then once you go into that, I mean, you're going into McCarthyism, really.
When does the left go too far? Dr. Jordan Peterson makes the point that our society needs a balance of left and right-wing ideas, and that the two sides can balance each other out. We also know that both sides can go too far. According to Peterson, however, it's very clear to us when the right goes too far, but we as a society don't know when the left has gone too far.
Well, we've kind of figured out when the right-wingers go too far. You know, right-wing identity politics devolves into claims of ethnic and racial superiority and moral justification on the grounds of those for actions based on those categories. When do the left-wingers go too far? Oh, we don't know. Well, first of all, we certainly know that they can go too far. If you don't understand that the left has gone too far, then you're woefully ignorant or you're willfully blind.
In today's new political landscape, where social justice protests often devolve into rioting, looting, arson, assault, and murder, and when the mainstream left defends, protects, and endorses the far left, including far-left violence and violent groups like Antifa, it's clear that our society does not know where to draw the line in saying the far left has gone too far. My guest today knows better than anyone that the left is capable of destroying our society, and that today's far left is getting more violent, more ideological, more radical, and all the while is being celebrated and promoted by our leftist cultural and political leaders. Chris Tomlinson is a British-Canadian journalist writing for Breitbart and covering international political news around the world. Since 2016, he's focused his reporting on violent far-left groups in Europe, particularly the rise of Antifa, and has watched how they've brought their tactics and their violence to North America. He's written extensively and understands who they are, where they came from, and what they want better than any other journalist out there. In our interview today, Chris helps break down who Antifa is, what they're trying to achieve, and how we can stop them. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining the True North Speaker Series. It's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I know about you because I think you're one of the first journalists, one of the most prominent journalists that has been covering Antifa, I think from day one. I don't know how long you've been doing it, but maybe you can just give us a very brief introduction to you and your journalism and how you started to cover the Antifa beat.
Sure. So I started with Breitbart back in, I believe it was February or January of 2016. And initially I was covering the biggest story right then, which was the migrant crisis. But I noticed along with all the stuff that was going on with the migrant crisis, you also had a lot of people in places like Germany and the UK working for NGOs. And a lot of these NGOs then were connected to left-wing groups who were then connected to other people, and there was this web that formed. And one part of this web was people like the Antifa, which stands for Anti-Fascist Action. A lot of people try and pass it off as just being anti-fascism in general, but it is definitely the action part that is the more interesting part of their behavior. And it really stemmed from the things from the migrant crisis during 2016. Obviously, the height of it was in 2015, the late summer and the autumn and winter of that year. But it was still going on in 2016. And all these links that I'd seen were the thing that really got me examining the different NGOs, then all these anti-hate groups who were also, trumpeting the call of refugees welcome, just as much as everybody else. And so that was really what got me down the rabbit hole that I've been going down ever since.
It's funny that you call them the anti-hate groups because my experience with those groups is that they're usually the most hateful among the groups, but they call themselves anti-hate, just like anti-fascists. You know, they brand themselves as doing good in the world, and I think that because they brand themselves that way, they've sort of tricked some journalists, or maybe some journalists are just on board, but they don't get the same kind of scrutiny as, say, far-right groups or other radical groups that are pushing violence. So you were observing what was happening in Europe, and did you see that activism sort of exploding into violence, or when was the first sort of instances of violence that you reported on and that you observed?
It was probably when I started seeing people protest against the not the migrant crisis itself, but the open border policies of people like Angela Merkel. You had these youth groups that were popping up all over Europe. Génération Identitaire, and the various other identitarian movements. You had Pegida, you had quite a few groups across Germany and France and other countries who were dropping banners and doing essentially the same type of protesting that Greenpeace was doing. And the people that were getting violent with them were the Antifa. They'd previously been known really just for fighting with people like far-right groups, for example, in Germany, the NPD, the National Democratic Party, as well as the BNP, British National Party in Britain. So real far-right groups. But then I saw that they were targeting these people who didn't appear to be far-right groups, but rather people that didn't want their borders to be open to millions upon millions of people from other countries. And so that was the first instances I started seeing them actively on the street engaging in violence with people.
And who, was it organized? Like, I know that the whole idea is that they're anarchists and they're decentralized and that they claim to not have any kind of organizational structure or any kind of leadership. Is that what you observed, or are there sort of key players involved?
There are definitely key players, and as far as a formal leadership structure, there isn't one really, but there are informal leadership structures in the sense that people who've been in those movements for a long time generally are looked up to by the people who haven't been. There are also people who are well connected into politics, well connected into the NGO sector, well connected into the media. And these people are either looked up to within the milieu of Antifa and the far left in general, or they are the ones, who they ask for advice. So somebody has been to, let's say, for example, the 2017 G20 protests in Hamburg, the Welcome to Hell protests, as they were called. People who were involved in that will be looked up to by the people who haven't been involved in any sort of rioting, and they'll ask them for advice. They'll ask them, should we do this protest? Should we do this riot? What should we do? And so while there aren't any formal leaders, there are people within the movement who are more respected than others, and could be called a de facto leadership within the groups.
Interesting. And so, I mean, there have been lots of incidents that have sort of propelled them into, our site here in North America. I think, obviously, when some of those anti-immigrant protests came to Canada, I remember there was a far-right group, Le Meurtre in Quebec, and they were protesting, and they were sort of met with a violent opposition. Antifa, obviously, with Donald Trump, I think during his inauguration and during the sort of women's march that came after, we saw sort of Antifa-like black bloc figures kind of coming in and rioting and creating some violence. Was that sort of the intro, or how did they come over here to North America?
Yeah, so a lot of these people that have been involved in what's branded as Antifa now have been in anarchist and far left circles for many, many years, or for decades even. Some of these people trace their lineage back to groups like the Weather Underground and people like that. The Antifa branding is relatively new. The black bloc tactics we've seen since, various G7 and G20 protests, either in Toronto, Seattle, and other places. That tactic has been around in North America for quite a few years. But the actual Antifa branding didn't really come until probably 2009, 2010, which is when we started seeing the first Antifa groups form in the United States, which is, we're talking people like the Rose City Antifa based out of Portland. We're talking about the Philly Antifa in Philadelphia. And in Canada, we see mostly Antifa anarchists centered around places like Montreal, where they have a very big influence there, in Toronto, in Hamilton, and some in Vancouver. But that's really, as far as Canada goes, those are the main hubs. When you see Antifa somewhere else, it's usually because they've been bussed in by people who are allies of them, whether it's NGOs or whether it's sometimes trade unionists and people like that.
It's interesting because, you don't really think of Portland, Oregon as being a big, center, but that seems to be where so many of these Antifa figures are based. And obviously they go after journalists like yourself and Andy Ngo, who really gets harassed and I think assaulted by these people. But I'm wondering, in Canada, why Hamilton? I've noticed, I've seen them at events out there. I've seen, I think that was where Maxime Bernier and Dave Rubin were doing an event that got protests. I believe that was in Hamilton. Why is it that Hamilton became sort of a center point for these folks here in Ontario?
Well, I think partially because it is very much sort of a working class town and has been a working class town for many, many years. It's very much an industrial town. I think that's part of it. So you have a traditional leftist union scene there. But I think another reason for it too is you have a lot of people from, when we're talking about Antifa people, the actual members, a lot of them are middle class, bourgeois, white, sons and daughters of business owners, of executives, of academics, of left-wing politicians, and people like that. And when you see Hamilton especially has become really, I don't want to say gentrified, but in recent years, it has definitely become a hub of places like, craft brewing and, craft restaurants and all sorts of sort of middle-class type things. So I think they were possibly attracted into that, and then came in and got involved in the left-wing scene, and then it sort of has spiraled from there. Like, one of the big meeting places in Hamilton is a place I believe is called Tower Books, which is an anarchist bookshop, which is one of the places that Antifa likes to organize, are in these various anarchist bookshops. And so when you see these places, generally it's a good bet that Antifa are either organizing there, or the people that run it are members or affiliates of the local Antifa cell that operates in that area.
Right, which is why you expect to see Antifa in places like San Francisco and Vancouver and Toronto, Montreal. But it is interesting that they've co-opted a place like Hamilton, which you'd think might have more sensibility and common sense than to jump on an anarchist movement. Although I'm sure 99% of the people in Hamilton oppose Antifa. Let's try to understand a little bit, Chris, about what it is that Antifa wants. Like, what are their goals? What are they trying to achieve here?
Sure. So a lot of their philosophy it comes down to anarcho-communism. And that is basically based off of a Russian thinker called Peter Kropotkin, and one of his books called The Conquest of Bread. What they would like to see is a stateless society of no government, no laws, no police, a classless society, a society that doesn't believe in anything except equality. They don't believe, they'd like to abolish things like money. They'd like to abolish work. So if somebody doesn't want to work, they shouldn't have to, but they should still, somehow be provided for. And so that their end goal really is the destruction of civilization itself, and the replacing of civilization with what they call a cooperative society, in the sense that, you see sort of groups on Facebook and places like that where somebody will say, if you paint my fence, I'll do a favor for you. And that's the sort of economy that they would like to see across the entire world. So you do something for me, I do something for you, but there's no money or anything or property or anything exchanged in these transactions. And that's kind of their end goal. It's very childish and very unrealistic. And a lot of the people who are serious members of Antifa probably don't believe in it. And definitely the people who are using Antifa for their own political ends don't believe in it either. I very much doubt you're going to see the CEOs of McDonald's or Nike or whoever else is supporting things like the Black Lives Matter movement or Antifa are going to be really too interested in abolishing money and abolishing capitalism.
Well, it's interesting because, we know that Marxism has been tried over and over again and failed across, different times, different cultures, different demographics, different societies. But the idea of just sort of destroying everything from the bottom, not having like a strong government come in and impose the system, but to kind of unravel it from the bottom. I don't know that it's ever been tried, and you can see the tactics sort of spreading, not just from Antifa, but there's lots of left-wing organizations that are trying to destabilize or pull apart the traditions of our society, whether they know that they're doing it or not, by erasing our history and trying to, the recent movement to defund the police. It's sort of interesting. I wish that they would try it on a smaller scale, rather than trying to just destabilize the entire society. I'll give you an example. I know a lot of libertarians that are sort of anarcho-capitalists, and they want to live in their little, libertarian communes. And what they do, they have a festival every year called Pork Fest, where they go off and they go camping. I think it's in New Hampshire, and they get a couple hundred people out, and they have this experiment where there's no money, and there's no government, and there's no laws, but everyone just sort of gets along, and it kind of works. But obviously it's not going to work on a bigger scale. I like to see Antifa try to maybe organize something like that instead of just trying to destabilize our whole societies. Chris, do they have anything like that, or is it usually just sort of a violent movement?
Well, there has been one thing that's tried back in, I believe it was 1919 to about 1921. There was a stateless area in the Ukraine that was formed as a sort of like an anarchist utopia that was soon crushed by the Bolsheviks in 1921, when Vladimir Lenin said he didn't like that very much. And so they didn't really have any defense when the Soviets came in and crushed them. So that's really the only example. I mean, people might point to things like the Paris Commune and a couple of other smaller scale examples as well. But whenever we see these so-called autonomous zones, like we've seen in Seattle pop up, we've seen them all over in Germany, in Italy, in France, and places like that. What they usually are, in Italy, they're called social centers. And what they are usually, the Antifa members will occupy a building that is either under repair, under construction, or has been abandoned completely. And they'll occupy it and use it as sort of a base where police aren't allowed in, and they'll attack police. And they use these places as sort of places that they can gather, and that they can, in France not too long ago, in Paris, they discovered that they were making bombs in one of these places. So they also use it to make weapons for rioting, ready-made Molotov cocktails, that sort of thing. What happens in these areas is most of the time they are facilitated by people from the outside. So, for example, in Germany, a lot of them are facilitated by NGOs or by Social Democrats and politicians from the left party and people like that. So they don't really survive on their own. But the actual things that go on there are mostly drug use, giving sorts of speeches, reading various anarchist pamphlets and books, and not a whole lot of much else, really.
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought up the example of CHOP or Chaz. It was called Chaz, then I guess that got made fun of too much, so they changed it to CHOP. But it was the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, and now it's the Capitol Hill Occupied Territory, which is a small part of downtown Seattle, the Capitol Hill neighborhood, which is sort of a counterculture hippie area in Seattle. And in the midst of these sort of Black Lives Matter, George Floyd protests that devolved into violence and riots and anarchy, a group of people somehow managed to take over a couple of city blocks in Seattle. The police department did not want to stand down, but the mayor, I believe, ordered them to. And so they were told to just let these people be and allow them to occupy an area of downtown Seattle. So I guess that would be an example of a smaller scale experiment, we should say, in sort of self-governance by these Antifa groups. I think it brought, it caused a bit of a surprise. It came by storm to a lot of people because they didn't really know much about these people. And I think the media has been very dishonest in the way they've covered it. I've seen clips of, reporters in the mainstream media describing it as like a block party or like a city camp out. But really, if you look at some of the reporting and some of the crime statistics. It seems like a pretty dangerous place to be, especially at night. You've been following this Occupy protest in Seattle. Chris, what do you make of it?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because people say that, they're getting along and all this kind of thing. They don't mention the fact that, that everything from their toiletries to the electricity that they're using to everything is really supplied by other people. The government came in and gave them a bunch of porta potties, and people are treating it more of a street festival in terms of how the local government's treating it. But the fact is, you have armed people roaming around, most notably the local warlord Raz the rapper, who goes around and enforces selectively whatever order that he can sort of muster, whether it's beating up somebody for doing graffiti or whatever. But there have already been, I believe, 3 shootings in the area. At least one person that I know has died. And the police refuse to go in because they know that if they do go in, then they're going to get attacked. And even the emergency services can't go in because if they go in, there's a potential they'll get attacked too. So they'd say, okay, well, we'll go in with police. Well, the police can't go in. So what happens is somebody gets shot, somebody gets sexually assaulted, which has also happened. And there's nobody to come and help them because they don't want the police there. And all they have is a ragtag group of people armed with small arms, long guns and pistols, who are there trying to enforce some semblance of order. But as soon as night goes down, I mean, it's really a dream for criminals because they can go in there and they can do more or less anything that they want. It's a dream for sort of anybody who wants to do something nefarious because it's very hard for the police to get in there to investigate, even after things have happened, to collect evidence or to do anything like that. So, I mean, anybody with a brain could have predicted that this would have been tragic from day one. And I think a lot of people in Seattle, especially in maybe not the local government, but the local police force, are really starting to become aware that, this isn't something that's going to end. It's going to keep happening. People are going to keep shooting each other. And if you let it continue, not only are people going to die, but there's not going to be any justice for the people their families as well, because there's not going to be able to be investigations into them either. So I think that project is going to come to a close relatively soon.
Well, let's hope so. But I mean, just going back to the sort of ideology that drives this idea and sort of the goals of Antifa, like how do they propose that they handle these kind of things? I mean, if they're calling for defunding the police and they believe that they can live in a society without laws or without sort of an authority to enforce the laws, I mean, how do they deal with crime? How do they deal with shootings and rapes and all the other things that are happening in CHOP?
Basically, it's mob rule. So the people accused will be, tried by a mob, and whoever seems to be the most reasonable and wins the side of the mob wins. And what happens to the other person? Well, it's up to the mob to decide. I mean, we've seen in the French Revolution that it ended up with people being beaten to death. It ended up with people being guillotined all over. So, I mean, that's the sort of justice the only real sort of justice that they can give, because they don't have any sort of central authority or any central judicial system to be able to dispense justice.
Well, that is truly terrifying, Chris, and hopefully we don't see any Antifa takeovers here in Toronto, because I don't think I would survive very long in that kind of environment. One of the things that I've noticed, and I think is really standing out to more and more people in the wake of these riots and the sort of looting that went on, is that the mainstream media is not telling it to us like it is. I mean, most people, I think almost everyone, agreed that what happened to George Floyd was a complete injustice and it was wrong, and police brutality is wrong, and police brutality targeted against the Black community is wrong. I think we all agreed on that. But then the protests quickly turned into riots, and the issue was that the mainstream media wasn't reporting it that way. The mainstream media insisted on calling them peaceful protests, peaceful protests, peaceful protests. Well, why do you need to even use the word peaceful? a protest by definition is peaceful. But the idea was that what we were seeing with our eyes showed us that it wasn't peaceful. And the way that the media covers groups like Antifa, I mean, they either ignore them and pretend that they don't exist, or they go the other way like the CBC does, by actually promoting and defending them. CBC's ran a couple of interviews and documentaries sort of purporting Antifa like heroes, like people who are coming in and saving us from this evil Nazi invasion that's supposedly happening all over the West. So why is it, do you think, that the mainstream media covers for these sort of what I would describe as left-wing thugs?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. I think the first reason being that a lot of people involved in the media are connected either indirectly or directly to members of Antifa. Very, very much so in Germany, very much so in the UK and in the United States. So those people have, a motivation to defend these people who are their friends, essentially. As for other people, I mean, are there far-right people in the world who are dangerous? Yes. There are definitely real far-right people. Are they as organized as, let's say, radical Islamists like ISIS? No. Are they as organized as left-wing extremists? No. But some of them are dangerous. And we have seen, for example, the Christchurch shooting. We've seen synagogue shootings in Halle in Germany. So we have seen these lone wolf people that are dangerous. And so there is a temptation for the media then to say that anybody who's opposing these people must therefore be a good person. And while that is true to an extent, Antifa sees that as validation of everything they do. And so they say, yes, we do confront real far-right people, but we're also going to use all of the credibility that you've given us to go after conservatives, because really they're just secret far-right people. And so that becomes the thing. And then you hear constantly in the media, oh, well, yeah, they're giving dog whistles. That's what they're doing. They're not admitting that they're far right. They're saying they're not. And nothing in their past seems to indicate that they are, but they're giving dog whistles. So they must secretly be far right. And then once you go into that, I mean, you're going into McCarthyism. Really, this person's a secret communist, a crypto communist, a crypto fascist. And so how far can you go into that? Well, you can go so far as to say, we had a thing a couple of years ago where, pranksters on the internet were saying that milk was a white nationalist drink or something. And I mean, once you get to that level of absurdity, and when the mainstream media goes, oh, yeah, well, that could be the case because these actual far right people are making, jokes about milk. So maybe milk is a secret far right, dog whistle or whatever. And so that becomes really the problem, especially because the far right in general, in most places, especially in Canada, is electorally non-existent. There is no far right party, like no openly fascist party. And if there is, they get maybe a couple of hundred votes in one riding, if they're lucky. It's the same all over in Europe too. You have real groups like Casa Pound in Italy or the NPD in Germany, who are real far-right groups, but they barely register on the spectrum. Instead, you see Antifa going after the Conservative Party. You see Antifa going after the populist parties because they use the legitimacy that they get from fighting and opposing actual far-right people, and then they use it to boost their agenda in order to attack the people who they really see as a threat, which is conservatives. And eventually it will be liberals, and then it will eventually be people who are just not as far left as they are. And they'll keep eliminating each opponent one by one by one.
It's remarkable, though, Chris, how, well, first of all, thank you for explaining it so clearly. I think that was one of the best explanations I've heard. It wasn't just the milk thing. There was all kinds of things that were supposedly dog whistles. Like even, for as long as I can remember, since I was a little kid, going like this means A-okay, or that's sounds good, and all of a sudden that was supposed to be a secret handshake for the far right, alt-right, and they even accused, I think, one of Brett Kavanaugh's assistants, who herself is Jewish, of because she was sitting there and somehow her hand was showing that, and they accused her of trying to do a dog whistle during his testimony, which is patently absurd. But for some reason, they're successful. I mean, you painted it pretty clearly that they, because they go after these violent extremisms. There was another example in Canada of a horrific shooting at a mosque in January 2018, where several people were murdered by a person who was obviously just an extremist, and I think in his case he was mentally ill as well. But they use that as an excuse to go after all conservatives, and I think we've all been painted with that brush from time to time. Us at True North, occasionally we get called far right. I usually try to fight it and get corrections. If a mainstream media outlet calls us far right, at least I'll get a correction, and they'll call us right wing instead, which is still sort of a pejorative term, but it's not quite as bad as far right. I know, and you're over at Breitbart. They constantly get called far right. Even recently, the Federalist, which is a pretty mainstream conservative news outlet in the U.S., was called far right by NBC News. So they're taking more and more steps towards painting all conservatives by this extremist label, far right. What does far right even mean, other than, like you said, it conjures images of Nazism and fascism, conjures images of violence and authoritarianism, which is pretty far from what conservatives really believe in. And so it's interesting where if you're far right, you're painted and written off as a violent extremist. But if you're far left, you're still kind of celebrated. Like the CBC calls Antifa far left, and it's almost like a compliment, like the need for far left activism in the Trump era kind of thing. So I kind of just want to stick on this topic. Why is it that that they're so successful with these methods, and that they get so much of a pass in the mainstream media?
Well, I think they get a pass for a number of reasons. I think there are people in the establishment, whether it's the media or corporations or Wall Street or politics, for example, the mainstream Liberal Party here in Canada, who are afraid of populism and are afraid of regular people. They're afraid that all the things that they have done to our countries across the West, that there is a backlash against it, whether that's mass migration, whether that is the financial crisis, whether that is the fact that most millennials, can't afford a house in somewhere like Toronto, or can't afford a house and to start a family in general. All of these things worry them. And so they see, I think, these people, Antifa, who are going out and physically confronting or doxing people online or doing all sorts of other things against these people who are, leaders of populist movements, or people who are journalists, such as myself and you, who are, talking to this audience of people who really the electoral system and the media and whoever have even forgotten, or they demonize. And I think they're very afraid of that. And I think that a lot of this is really a marriage of convenience. I don't think that people in the media, the top of CBC, really care too much about what Antifa wants to do with society. I don't think that they're really that concerned about them overthrowing society. Perhaps they should be, but they're not. I think they're more interested in keeping their own cocktail parties going and keeping their own lifestyles going, as many people are, concerned more about their careers than they are about any sort of political ideology. So I think it's really a marriage of convenience. I think there are dangerous precedents set in the past for these types of marriage of convenience, specifically when we look into the 1930s, when we saw a lot of the German establishment looking for a way to quell what they saw as a movement that was coming for them and coming for their luxuries and their lifestyles, which was the communist movement that was supported by the Soviet Union. And so they saw and they looked for somebody who was fighting against those people in the streets. And who did they find? Well, they found the Nazi Party. And the Nazi Party then promised them, look, we'll sort these communists out. Support us, industrialists, bankers, corporations, and we'll make sure that they don't threaten you. And then, they thought that they could control the Nazi party, and obviously they couldn't. And I fear that a lot of the people nowadays in the mainstream are making a similar mistake in the fact that they're supporting groups like Black Lives Matter while they're smashing down statues. The other day they said they were going to, Sean King on Twitter said he wanted to smash down statues and stained glass windows of Jesus because he was too European, I believe. And so I think they're playing a very dangerous game in supporting these people, because I think if they do give them enough of a rope, it'll be they will be the hangman that will be coming for the establishment in the end when they've got rid of everybody else.
Well, one of the other things, I mean, the Antifa movement that you see, I mean, they're pretty open about their calls for violence and their tactics. They use the term direct action instead of actually calling for violence. But if you look into what they mean by direct action, it's a pretty straightforward call for violence to combat the other side before supposed violence is going to take place. And I think there's been a lot of confusion, Chris, around the term violence and what it means, because people on the left will claim that speech is violence, that if you don't identify someone by the correct pronouns, for instance, that's violence, or if you refuse to say Black Lives Matter, or if you run a piece that doubts the narrative of Black Lives Matter, it's because you're committing violence towards people of color. But then when they actually have violence, when they're looting, when they're smashing windows, and when they're calling for their direct action, which really is violence. Remember, there was a meme a couple of years ago about punching a Nazi, that you'd rather punch a Nazi and all this kind of stuff. Actually calling for violence. Jordan Peterson always raises a question about when it comes to the right and the far right, we know where the line is when they've gone too far, and it's usually when they start talking about race and ethnic superiority. That's sort of the line where we say, okay, you're no longer welcome in polite society. You've gone too far. You're fringe. You're gone. But on the left, we don't have that line. It seems like it pretty clearly could just be, the line could be violence. If you call for violence, that's crossing the line. And yet they've sort of blurred the term, and we don't even really know what violence means anymore. If it were up to you, and you know so well because you follow this issue so closely, where would you draw that line of where we should start sort of excommunicating the left and saying, you're too fringe, you're too far to the left, you're no longer part of the general discourse?
Yeah, I think the line should be drawn at violence itself. I don't think that violence has any place in a democracy. I think violence in the name of politics is a direct attack on democracy, because you're essentially saying that voting doesn't matter, that only violence solves things. So you can't really believe in democracy. And if you believe in violence against political parties, you certainly don't believe in democracy. So if we want to have a democracy, then we can't have any political violence, and everybody should be condemning political violence regardless of where it's coming from. If it's coming from somebody on the left, if it's coming from somebody on the right, if it's coming from somebody that you politically agree with or somebody that you don't politically agree with. Any calls for violence, in my mind, are anti-democratic, and they should be treated under the law as anti-democratic. And I think that we should have, as we have hate crime laws that are, we give people a larger sentence for something when it's classified as being motivated by hatred. I think we should have similar laws for people who attack democracy, that crimes, an assault is one thing, but a politically motivated assault should be considered an attack on democracy, and you should get a more severe sentence, just as you do with the hate crime.
That's an interesting proposition. I've never heard it before. But the example that you gave of Sean King calling for violence, he's obviously one of the early Black Lives Matter organizers, calling for the destruction of Christian churches and smashing of stained glass windows, tearing down Jesus statues. By the left's own definition, that would qualify as what they call cultural genocide, and yet here he is calling for a direct attack against Christianity's core institutions, and we do see other calls for violence. I think there's a pretty big difference between criticizing the political movement Black Lives Matter, which is directly run by people who are self-described Marxists, who call for the end of the nuclear family, who do things like calling for the destruction of Christianity. I mean, those are pretty extreme ideas, Chris. But in today's modern landscape, it seems like you can't really criticize that group. They're seen as off limits, and people who do dare to criticize them are written off as being terrible racists. So how can we combat that sort of attack? I would say it's an attack on our democracy because it's an attack on free speech and free thought. They are trying to intimidate us into not having conversations and not criticizing an organization that has very radical ideas and much like Antifa, really call for the destruction of basic institutions in our civilization.
Yeah, I think that, a lot of these groups will use these things that a lot of people can agree with. So a lot of people can say, are you against fascism? And the average person on the street would say yes. Does that mean then that people who say that they're against fascism should be allowed to go and burn down the house of a politician they don't like? No. And they use this term and say, well, if you don't let me do that, then you must be a fascist because I am an anti-fascist. So therefore I can do anything I like. Well, no, it doesn't work like that, and it never will work like that. The same thing with Black Lives Matter. I don't know anybody in my personal life that I've ever met who would say that Black people's lives don't matter. Of course they matter. Everybody's life matters. Are people having difficulties in certain communities? Yes. Do we need to address these in a sensible manner? Of course we do. But the idea that you can use that then to springboard and say, okay, well, if you don't believe in smashing up a church, or if you don't believe in tearing down a statue of Abraham Lincoln, or of John A. MacDonald, or of General Cornwallis, or somebody who has nothing to do with slavery, nothing to do with America. General Cornwallis might have fought the Americans once, but they have nothing to do with that. But they use that as an excuse to say, well, if you don't support everything that I do, then you must be an evil person because you don't believe in this. I mean, rational people should be able to say, no, you can still think that Black people's lives matter without engaging in violence, without engaging in smashing up churches, without engaging in defacing and vandalizing war memorials. I think that these two things are completely separate, but we live in such an age of hysteria among the left especially, but among people in general that's been whipped up by the media and by other people, that a lot of people just go along with it because they think, well, it's just a statue. Well, that shop probably has insurance. They don't think of the consequences that letting these things go on, what happens, which is basically, these neighborhoods where everything's burnt down. They say, oh, well, Target and Walmart and these big corporations, they have insurance. Maybe they do. But what if they don't come back? What if they say, okay, well, we'll take our insurance money and we'll go somewhere else where our shop isn't going to get looted and burned down? What if, the people in those communities now are poorer? They have less access to jobs, even if those jobs were only minimum wage, they're still a job. And they have less access to a tax base, which gives them less access to educational funding. It gives them less access to social services. I mean, the impact of these things really should be considered, but it isn't, because people would rather smash things and they would rather say, I'm doing something, I'm fighting oppression, but they're not really in any measurable term. They are doing harm, both culturally, physically, and economically.
Well, and allowing them to carry on this way. I mean, I think that there's two things happening. There's sort of a paralysis where people who would normally stand up against it, people who would normally speak out against it, are being kind of marginalized or silenced, either, with the term far right. Anyone who criticizes the movement gets written off as being far right, or, canceled, that kind of thing. And because you don't have the sort of mainstream voices criticizing it, most people in their own lives, even if they question, I don't agree with this, but I'm not going to post about it on Facebook because I don't want to potentially lose my job, or I don't want to have people who don't know me that well think that I must have like racist intentions because I'm not going along with it. And then I think it has a secondary impact where there's just a lot of sort of young people out there who are ignorant to the facts, that don't do the research, and they truly believe that police officers in Canada and the US are out there sort of committing mass violence against people of color intentionally, that there's this mass, pandemic of cops just murdering people. And, the impression that they get really goes to undermine confidence in a police system, the sort of underpinnings of the rule of law and law and order in our society. And I think it can be really dangerous. I think we're starting to see a little bit of that. I mean, there were certain nights during the protests where it felt like civilization was coming apart. It felt like we were living in a dystopian novel, looking at footage of New York City riots and thinking how terrifying it would be to live there. I can't imagine how terrifying it would be to live in the Capitol Hill neighborhood in Seattle and have to worry about, leaving home or getting groceries, or if you work there, getting to work. And it's sort of like, it could potentially be what's to come if we continue to allow our society to go down that path. So what is the antidote? How can we properly fight back against this movement?
Really, I think it just comes down to people willing to put something on the line, whether that is their job, whether that is simply standing outside in front of a statue of a non-controversial figure like Sir Winston Churchill, who's suddenly become a controversial figure. Just standing outside and saying to these people, no. It's as simple as that. No. We can talk. We can have discussions about the role of the police, about actual police brutality. And don't get me wrong, there are cases of police brutality. There are cases of police abusing their office and abusing their station. We've seen that in Canada. We've seen it all over. Does it happen? Yes, of course it happens. Does it happen anywhere near the scale of, an industrial killing machine of RCMP on horseback with rifles gunning people down? No. And it never has any time in our history. So the reality is so much different from what is being propagated by these activists and allowed to be propagated without any sort of critical questioning from the media, that the real pushback has to come in just recognizing what reality is and getting people to accept what reality is. And the fact is that reality in Canada is not the reality of the United States. It is not the reality of Britain. It is not the reality of Russia. It is not the reality of South Sudan. These are all different places that have their own issues, and they definitely do have issues. And we should, in our own countries, work to fix those. The fact that there are Aboriginal people in Ontario that don't have proper drinking water is a major issue, and it should be solved. It is definitely something that we can fix and that we should fix. Does it mean that we should start smashing up statues of people like John A. MacDonald's? Will that get those people fresh water? No, of course it won't. It might make some bourgeois, middle-class student or Antifa member feel better about themselves, but it doesn't help anybody. And I think that that's what people really need to do, is they need to get round and they need to identify the real issues and say, how can we actually fix these without making everything worse, or without giving into a mob that really only wants to destroy our society.
And really, it shouldn't take a instance of police brutality in the United States to force this kind of action in Canada. It's interesting to see all of these lawmakers, all of these politicians from across the spectrum, conservative, liberal, NDP, stand up sanctimoniously and declare that Canada is a systemically racist country. It's like, well, you guys are in charge. You guys are the lawmakers. If you truly believe that Canada is this rotten country that is full of racism, why did it take a huge tragedy in the United States for you to get your act together to calling it out and deciding that we should do something about it? I mean, if that's what they believe, then they've been complicit in it for years. Well, you said that the media is also complicit in it, and I really want to talk about Breitbart, because I feel like obviously Andrew Breitbart was a brilliant man and a great man, and his legacy. I mean, I think that in the 2016 election campaign, Breitbart was getting more page hits than CNN. And I think it was the #1 news website in America because people just were fed up with the mainstream media. They knew that they were being fed lies and the things that they were being told about Donald Trump weren't necessarily true. I just looked this up, a Vice article about Breitbart in December 2019, so about 6 months ago. They said this: with just 4 million followers, Breitbart's page racked up more likes, comments, and shares since September, 57.8 million, than the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and USA Today combined, who had 42.6 million. So must be exciting, Chris, to be part of such a successful, rising media empire. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's like over at Breitbart and how you guys are able to just, massively punch above your weight and outperform the biggest media companies in the world?
Well, I think it really just comes down to the talent that we have on board. I mean, we have great writers, we have great researchers, great journalists, and people really that aren't in it for their paycheck. They're not people that go to work every day and just punch in and say, okay, well, look at the watch. Okay, 8 hours, I'll just grind it out. These are people who have a passion, who wake up in the morning, go to bed late at night, are willing to work whenever they need to work to get the story, willing to go wherever they need to go to get the story, and to really explain things on the level for people to understand, to be able to really put context into things that the media often doesn't, and really give other sides of the story that the media won't say. I mean, for me personally, I almost exclusively write about things that are going on in Europe, because really the news that I read is in a different language. So there are not too many people I know in Canada that are reading Italian or Swedish or German or French news. Instead, they rely on someone like the BBC or CNN, who will pick apart, various sort of big stories, but really a lot of the other interesting stories they completely leave altogether. And so what I do is I try and inform people of what's really going on in those countries. And I think it's a valuable thing, because I think a lot of people really, even on the right, are completely, their worldview is completely beholden to whatever a liberal editor in Toronto or New York or London is telling them that it is. So that, I think, is a problem. But I think our company in general, Breitbart in general, we're just willing to go that extra mile. We're willing to work very, very hard. And as I said, people they're not in it for a cushy job that's going to be easy, where they get, giant trips paid for them with 5-star hotels and whatever. We're muckrakers, and we, keep our nose to the ground, and we work extremely hard. And I think that's the reason for our success, is because we are very, very passionate people.
Well, and you have a much better sense of what's going on in the country and the world than the sort of fancy journalists who refuse to tell the stories. And you're totally right about Europe. Like, we get the main news. We get told when there's a terrorist attack, but not much else. I mean, sometimes you'll follow people on Twitter who will be talking about how there's constantly bombs going off in Sweden, and you would never see anything like that written about in The Economist or told on the BBC. But there's all kinds of sort of violence that is happening. As far as Breitbart, though, I mean, how has Breitbart managed to sort of maintain? Because there's been a really coordinated effort. We were talking about it a little earlier on about the sort of slur that we get called far right, or that you get called far right because of your conservative editorial bent. And I feel like there's been a coordinated effort to try to get your advertisers to leave, get your platforms taken away from you, get the social media companies to crack down on you, because obviously they're threatened by what Breitbart is able to do and how many people you're able to reach. So is that a big concern for you guys, or is that just sort of a distraction?
I really couldn't speak to the sort of concern that we have editorially, as I'm not an editor, so that sort of thing is a bit above my pay grade, so to speak. For me personally, I mean, I look at that stuff and I see, the old adage of when you get the flak, it's when you're over the target. So to me, it just means work harder, go harder, write more, do more. It doesn't it doesn't discourage me one bit. In fact, it encourages me, because it just makes me want to push that much harder, because I know that the people who are our audience are common, decent, hardworking people, whether they're in America, Canada, the UK, or anywhere else. And so the idea that somebody, some bigwig in New York or San Francisco or LA is going to call them all far-right extremists when all they want to do is have a good life for them and their children and their families. I just think that's it's absurd, and it would be a disservice to them if I let those people get away with it, and I let them try and dissuade me or anybody else from writing about what I want to write about and getting to the truth of stories.
Well, that's great. I know you're based in Toronto, but you write mainly about Europe. So does Breitbart have sort of plans to come into Canada? Do you guys have any kind of presence here? I know you sometimes write about what's going on, sometimes comment on Justin Trudeau, but not too much. So how come Breitbart's ignoring Canada so much, Chris?
That's another question that would have to be put to our editors and to management. Yeah, I cover occasionally a couple of things that are going on in Canada. Those are some of the bigger stories, obviously, that are more international. But as for any sort of expansion here, I couldn't say. Not really something that I've been informed about or would have any sort of a hand in.
Fair enough. Well, what is your take on the sort of media landscape here in Canada? I mean, we have very, very high trust still. I mean, relative to our American friends, Canadians still have a high degree of trust in the mainstream media, but we're certainly seeing declining numbers, especially over at the CBC, where their television viewership rates are just plummeting. Their ad sales are down significantly. And what we see from the Trudeau government is sort of more and more attempts to centralize, to provide more government involvement in the media landscape, be it the media bailouts or increased government ads going to their favored newspapers, and then also lots of money to the CBC. What is your take on the media landscape, and do you think there's a need for more independent journalism?
I think there's definitely a need for more independent journalism. I think the entire Canadian media landscape, the mainstream media landscape, is on the left or the far left. There is no mainstream media really that I can think of. I mean, the National Post used to be conservative, but I mean, you wouldn't think that reading it today. So I think that there's not really much on the right currently, on the conservative right, in the sense that, I think the Toronto Sun would be one of the few newspapers, but even then I would say that it would be center right. I wouldn't put it completely on the right wing. And you compare it to places like, I look at media from Germany and Italy and places like that. There is no equivalent of Il Giornale from Italy and Canada. There's no real equivalent of something like Die Welt or Junge Freiheit or some of these other papers. I think Canada really, especially when it comes to editorial, is completely either center left or far left. I don't think that you get, other than maybe, as I said, the Toronto Sun, which I know that you write for. And so I think that's one of the few that does. So I think that there's a lot of room really within the right in a number of places. Perhaps not as much. There's maybe a little bit more right-wing mainstream media in Quebec. But Quebec is almost, media-wise, is pretty much a different country. Very few people outside of the Ottawa bubble who read French language news. People in Alberta generally don't.
Well, and I think
So
that's a shame because I feel like the French media are better than the English media nationally. There's so many times where something will have happened. There'll be a scandal or something that Trudeau should have something to explain to. And his friends in the English media, the Parliamentary Press Gallery, are completely silent. One example was he broke his own social distancing rules by going to his holiday home, his cottage, over Easter. There wasn't a single English question about that, even though he had said on record as recently as the Friday before Easter that you shouldn't travel, and the border was closed. The Quebec-Ottawa border was closed. And then the second one, after Trudeau lost his UN Security Council seat that he had been campaigning for half a decade, the French media asked him about it, but there was not a single question from the English media. So we see that the French language media are better, at least at holding Justin Trudeau to account. I don't know how conservative they are, but at least they're willing to ask tough questions sometimes.
yeah, absolutely. There's been many times that I've found more interesting stories on even Radio Canada than on the CBC, or a completely different spin on a English language story in French that had details that were more interesting from my point of view as a conservative. So I think that there's a lot of room within the media landscape, but it is the problem being is that the traditional media is really dying off, in the sense that if you wanted to start a newspaper today, you might as well just throw your money in a fire, because it's not really probably going to go anywhere in a major level. You're not going to be able to reach Globe and Mail or National Post or Toronto Sun levels anymore. For a small company, that just isn't really possible, because everybody's switching to getting their news from social media or getting it from websites like ours. So really, you have to look at it through the way that Andrew Breitbart did it, which is that you have to be very talented. You have to go for stories that people want, and then you have to, just work and work and work and work and work as hard as you can in order to do it and get out there and get out to people. That's one of the things that really the media misses nowadays, is that they're not getting out to people in general. They're going out. Maybe a CBC reporter will pop out of their office on Front Street in Toronto and walk around the block and go ask somebody their opinion, but they're not going to a small town in rural Northern Ontario. They're not going to a small town in the Maritimes. And if they are, it's local news and it's not published globally. These people then justly feel that their opinion doesn't matter. And so that's really a big problem. And if you had people on the ground doing citizen-style journalism and really getting that out there and using the power of the internet to do it, I think that there is a huge appetite for that.
Well, I think we're seeing that even with True North, the Post Millennial, the Rebel, getting way more views and shares on social media than the big guys with the huge budgets, because I think exactly what you're identifying there. Well, Chris, there isn't really a right wing presence or a right conservative presence in the mainstream media. But what about the political landscape in Canada? Because I sometimes feel that the Conservative Party isn't very conservative, and depending on who they're going to choose as their leader in the next leadership race, potentially the party could be run by someone who's more of a centrist or even someone who's center-left. What is your take on the sort of political landscape and specifically the Conservative Party of Canada?
I think the problem of conservatism across the West is that economics is the prime motivation. So everything is based around economics first. So it doesn't matter the social policies as long as, we can cut taxes by a couple of points. And that becomes really, they ignore everything that the left is doing in the social realm, and focus solely on winning votes through economics. I think that's the big problem with conservative parties, not just in Canada, but in the Western world in general, is that they completely ignore social conservatism. And that's why you see the rise of populist parties that seem to sort of defy the right-left paradigm as we would see it in North America or in Britain, where you have somebody like the Rassemblement National with Marine Le Pen, who is somewhat left on economics, but very right on social issues. And so we don't really have anybody that's very right on social issues, because it's not acceptable for anybody to be right on social issues. And when they are, they get generally hounded by the press hounded by all sorts of people, even though they might represent quite a few people, not just people who are traditional conservative voters, but former left-wing voters who just might be socially conservative. I mean, I come from a working class family in Britain, and my family has always been, my grandfather was a solid Labour supporter, but he was also very socially conservative. And so now in Britain, Boris learned that lesson. And he said, look, there are people who want Brexit, who are socially conservative, who we could get to vote for us, because the Labour Party has become a very socially progressive party when it used to be more about economics. And that's the interesting thing, perhaps, is that the left is focused now on social issues and less on economic issues, while the right focuses mostly on economic issues and very seldom on social issues. So I think in Canada, we have perhaps a better chance than some other places, for example, in the UK. We still have conservatives that believe in gun ownership. We still have conservatives that believe in, the right that are pro-life. We still have conservatives that believe in traditional marriage. We still have conservatives that believe in a lot of social conservative things. They may be more on the fringes than they've ever been in the Conservative Party, but they still exist. In the UK, they really don't. And if they do, then they're forced out quite quickly.
Well, and I feel like in the UK, it's more of sort of a class divide. I noticed that I was in London about a year and a half ago covering one of Tommy Robinson's trials, and it seemed like the people who were supporting Tommy were sort of more of an underclass. And the way that I was sort of chatting a little bit here and there with fellow journalists, and the way that they sort of described the people at the protests and kind of turned their nose up at them. They really had a disdain for working people. And also just very anecdotally, I was in a taxi cab in London, and I got talking to the driver coming back from the airport, and he started telling me about how he was a lifelong Labour supporter, but he wasn't going to vote for Jeremy Corbyn because he didn't agree with him, and that he was pro-Brexit, and that he was actually pro-Tommy Robinson. So kind of exactly what you were describing there, like I would say more of a socially conservative person who was opposed to open borders, but still had the sort of economic background as being sort of more of a, I guess, pro-welfare state and big government. We didn't get into all that, but that's what I assume he meant by, a Labour background. Well, in Canada, we have sort of a break-off party with the People's Party of Canada, but even they are fiscally libertarian, and I think not very socially conservative. I think Maxime Bernier really understands the cultural issues at play, and he's very good at communicating that, but still not really what you're describing in terms of populism. You describe yourself as a high Tory populist, so can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. So a high Tory is somebody who recognizes that the crown is the most important institution next to God in our country, that all legitimacy comes from the crown itself, that a constitutional monarchy is the best system ever invented by man, and that in a populist sense, I believe that regular people should have more influence in the political system. I think that the middle class bourgeois elites, that university educated people from well-off families or decently well-off upper middle class type people, bourgeois as I would describe them, these people have essentially all of the power in most Western countries. The people have very little. The monarch certainly barely has any. And I think that the people really should have more of an influence, whether we're talking something like the yellow vests in France proposed a system in which the public could use referenda in order to propose new laws and in order to get rid of ones that the general public thought were no longer in the interest of the public. I'd like to see something like that implemented in our countries, where referendums are things that the parliament can use to advise itself, or that the monarch can use to advise the monarch and the crown before they sign laws into laws, so that the people have much more of a say, and that not just their representatives in these parties that are completely controlled by one class, by this upper middle class intelligentsia. And so you would have things like Brexit. You would have things like the electoral college system in the United States, which really gives more regular people a voice in politics. And I think that would be a much better thing and a much healthier thing for our society.
As far as the monarchy goes, I'm generally in agreement, and I think it's a good sort of stabilizer in case you ever have a truly terrible elected government that they could dispose of. But would you be at all concerned? I mean, in the UK, Queen Elizabeth is aging, and her son Charles has shown sort of more an affinity towards politics. I mean, he's taken political stances, which is something the Queen has never done. And I think probably Prince William's a bit better in terms of staying apolitical. I would have been more worried about Harry, who is also very vocal in his politics from time to time. Do you think that is a threat to the monarchy if you have sort of an activist king?
I don't think it's a threat to the monarchy itself, no. Some of the things that Prince Charles champions are things that I would agree with him on, whether that is his stance on architecture, whether that is his stance on localism, on supporting local farmers, local produce, local communities, that kind of thing. But when we talk about things like climate change, I might be a little bit more in disagreement with him. But I think that the king or queen's voice in matters, as long as it's used sparingly, is very powerful. When the Queen came out to talk about the coronavirus, that was very powerful for a lot of us monarchists and a lot of subjects of Her Majesty in general. And so I think used sparingly in the right moment, that can be very important, and it can be more important than any presidential address or any address from any politician.
I agree that when Queen Elizabeth speaks, it's very powerful just because she does it so rarely, and she just happens to be a terrific speaker who really says the thing that's needed to be said. So as far as sort of taking your worldview and bringing it back home to Canada, what would you like to see in the next leader? How do you think any of the current, four people who are running for leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada sort of embody that? Are you leaning towards any of them? And, what would you like to see for someone running up against Justin Trudeau in the next election?
On a base level, I'd like to see somebody who could beat him. But having said that, I don't really see anybody with any sort of, revolutionary zeal in them in any shape or form. I don't think any of the current candidates are beyond, what we've seen from Conservatives for the past 20 years. So I don't think there's going to be a massive change regardless of who wins. Really, Conservatism has become not trying to counter what the Liberals and the left are doing, but rather trying to slow them down. And so maybe there's one candidate that can slow them down a bit better than another, but I don't think there's any candidate that's going to get in front of them and start pushing them backwards. So I'm fairly pessimistic when it comes to politics in Canada, which is, one reason I would like to see referendums, because I think that politics in general, unless somebody unknown comes to the fore, I think the people are better at deciding things than the politicians often that run for office.
Well, I think it was Bill Buckley, his famous line about the purpose of conservatism is to stand athwart history yelling stop. So just trying to stop the momentum of the progressives in their crusade towards a cliff. I think the idea is really interesting of having more referendum, because I know that there's so many issues. We do some polling over at True North, and we had a recent poll that found that 3/4 of Canadians wanted a total moratorium, a total ban on immigration until the coronavirus ends. It's obviously not happening. Canada is still welcoming hundreds of thousands of people this year in 2020, and other issues, be it taxes or social issues. I think even on issues like abortion, where you think that most Canadians are now pro-choice. When it comes to specifics about laws around late-term abortion or sex-selective abortion, the polling is quite different, and most Canadians would be on the other side. Would you be worried at all, though? I mean, I lived in California for a few years, and they do this sort of direct democracy thing, and the problem that they ran into was that people usually vote yes for new spending initiatives, and they vote no for new taxing initiatives. So eventually, you go bankrupt.
Yeah, of course that's a problem. But I mean, there are ways that you can have checks and balances on the implementation of referendums and how they could be done. If a referendum simply isn't possible, then, or it's illegal, then the courts should be able to rule on that and decide. Explain to people why this isn't possible, or whatever the case may be. That's why I think that in a better system, we would have referenda really as not as a legally binding thing necessarily, but as an advisory to whether it's the party in power, whether it's the monarch or the governor general or whoever, to say to them, like, how popular is this law that these MPs want to pass? Do people actually want this? Where, let's say that the Trudeau government said we're going to have 1 million immigrants a year now, and the governor general was like, well, I don't know about that. How about we put it to a referendum? The people then can decide, do you actually want this? And if the people say no, then the governor general says, sorry, no.
So you'd want to see a more kind of activist role, because the Governor General in Canada doesn't really do anything. I mean, the only time you ever really hear about her is if there's the media is doing some kind of puff piece about her, or I think the last time that the Governor General played a vital role was when the Harper government tried to prorogue Parliament. I think that was back in 2008. Or maybe it was 2010, when the other parties were trying to do a coalition, and so Harvard tried to prorogue Parliament and did, and that was sort of the only time that the Governor General ever did anything active. But you would like to see a more active role there.
Yeah, absolutely, because I think that otherwise, what's the reason for it? A lot of people talk about abolishing the Senate and saying that it doesn't do enough. Well, okay, if it doesn't do enough, then either make it do something or get rid of it. Because really there needs to be more checks and balances in the political system. That's one thing the Americans got right, was that they had a lot of checks and balances within their system. And unfortunately, in other English-speaking countries, we have hollowed out a lot of those checks and balances because either we felt they were outdated. For example, the House of Lords, we got rid of the hereditary lords because we thought they were outdated, but we replaced it with something that wasn't as good and didn't have the same checks and balances. So we either need to figure out new checks and balances, or we need to find some way of restoring the old ones.
Interesting. Yeah, those are good points. I hadn't really thought too much about that, but I'll give that some thought, Chris. So, we cover some pretty depressing issues, and especially you constantly looking at these violent left-wing anarchists. Is there anything that makes you feel optimistic, or anything positive that you see going on that you think is pointing us in the right direction?
Yeah, I think that just seeing people speak out about things and seeing people really realize what a lot of these left-wing extremists actually believe and what they actually want to do. Because I think a lot of people thought that these people were either, just bluffing and that they were just talking a good game, but really they wanted the same thing and the same, American dream house with a white picket fence kind of thing that everybody else does. But now they realize that these people are actually serious. So I'm hoping that they're going to see that and say, okay, well, maybe we have to get a little bit more serious too. And maybe we have to vote for people that are going to actually counter this. And where are we as a society and where do we need to be going as a society in order to be a healthy society? I think these are big questions that are being raised, and I think that it's important that they are, because they've been under the surface for a very, very long time, and they haven't been addressed. And instead, the left has been allowed to have a monopoly on everything to do with all of these ideas. And now that we know where their revolution will go, perhaps conservatives can start looking at the same problems and producing their own solutions to them.
Well, absolutely. I think that's a great note to end on, Chris. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us at the True North Speaker Series. Really appreciate it. Chris Tomlinson from Breitbart News. Have a great night.
Thank you.